So my name is Justin Higa, and like you said, I'm a postdoc at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and I study landslides and yeah, how they affect us on the islands today and possibly how they've affected people in Hawaii for as long as it was inhabited. And I am particularly, or I'm going to talk about bedrock strength because that parameter is what's controlling a lot of bedrock landslides. And I don't think I need to belabor it to geologists, but I mean, landslides are hugely deadly natural disasters that kill tens of thousands worldwide, tens in the US, and cause so much damage. This is a picture of one of the many Haines landslides in southeastern Alaska in 2020. In 2020, when a huge an atmospheric river hit southeastern Alaska, and it brought a bunch of heavy rain, heavy snow. It killed like 2 people. It destroyed a bunch of houses, and it cut off a bunch of houses. And this was between Thanksgiving and Christmas, so it's a time when people are home, and it's so horrible that this happened during this time. And of course, geologists were called in to respond to these natural disasters. This is a map of that Haines area, and the red point is where that one landslide in the picture happened. So yeah, in the following days and weeks, they were called in to assess whether it was okay to go back home. But in the following months and years, they were commissioned, or the Alaska Division of Geological and Geophysical Surveys was commissioned to do a bunch of rock quality surveys around this whole area where the landslides happened, in kind of the same situation where you have a waterway on one side, a highway in the middle, and a steep mountain on the other side. And each of these points is where they did those surveys, traditional fracture mapping with the Brunton and stuff like that. But also they use something called a Schmidt hammer, this little device right here, which measures rock strength. And if you're in something like construction, they use that a lot for like concrete strength testing, but it's perfect for the field because you can take 1,000 measurements really easily, kind of average out any user error and kind of get a rough estimate of how strong that rock is. And one thing that might control the bulk strength of a whole outcrop is the fracture spacing in those rocks up in the mountains, whether they are sparsely distributed or they're really dense and that rock is really chewed up. And things like these bedrock characteristics will affect maybe like the size of the sediment when it's denuded into channels and transported by debris flows. Maybe the sparser areas produce bigger bedrock, bigger sediment in these areas that are then transported by debris flows and cluvial areas, by fluvial transport in the streams, eventually deposited at the bottom. And one thing that might, or we geomorphologists like to look at things in terms of climate and tectonics, and climate through chemical weathering will fracture bedrock. Climate through temperature fluctuations, for example, can propagate crack tips to fracture bedrock differently. Also, tectonic activity and deformation will affect the fracture density in bedrock. And I'd like to focus on a couple of these to answer how does this affect the erosion and landslides after all is said and done. And one of the places that often gets called a natural laboratory for studying erosion is Hawaii. And I'm going to focus on this one specific volcano in the square here. This is West Maui. If you see, this is Lahaina, where the deadly wildfires happened in 2023. But we're going to look at the whole volcano here. So Hawaii is in the middle of the Pacific Plate. There is very low tectonic activity. Maybe the only tectonic activity is any isostatic rebound from the weight of the island, but that's pretty negligible compared to any tectonically active area. And it also has a really dramatic rain gradient from the windward side on the east to the leeward side on the west because of the trade winds coming from the northeast that are bringing moist air right into the coast, causing or forming these lush rainforests all the way down to the ocean. You look at the leeward side, Lahaina is right here where those wildfires happened, and it's really dry at the coast. So there's a really stark rainfall gradient that I thought was easier shown on satellite image than like a rainfall map. It's green on one side, it's dry and pretty arid on the other side. Another thing that makes Hawaii a great natural lab is that it's all basalt. On West Maui specifically, from the bottom of the subaerial portion is about 2 million years, and the top is about 1 million years old, and it's just stacks on stacks on stacks of different basalt flows. And so it's kind of a tempting place to study the effects of erosion and landslides and sedimentation on both the leeward-facing, dry, dusty, brown side of the island versus the lush, green, rainy side, and compare how erosion differs on both sides. And in fact, geomorphologists have done this. I'm going to take us to the island of Kauai on the far west side. It's about 5 million years old. And people have shown that as on the x-axis is rainfall, on the y is erosion rates from different valleys. And as you might expect, as each valley gets rainier and rainier, the erosion rate from that valley increases. On this other plot, I'm going to take us to the far east of the main Hawaiian Islands, to the big island of Hawaii. On the x-axis, again, is mean annual precipitation, and on the y is the strength measurement from those Schmidt hammers. And as you go to rainier areas, those rocks tend to get weaker and weaker, presumably by climate-induced chemical weathering, or climate-induced weathering. And this is all fine and dandy for just creating experiments to test erosion. Why is it bigger? Okay, cool. For testing erosion, but not all lithologies on Hawaii are the same. For example, this is a map. Whoops. This is a map of West Maui again. Some parts in this purple here, the erosion into the valley was so great that it exposed the cumulate core of the old caldera, or the old magma chamber, where olivines and pyroxenes kind of settled out. In the caldera itself, there are also these caldera sequences, which are full of basaltic dikes, breccias, hydrothermal alteration. And these caldera sequences are pretty ubiquitous across a lot of these older islands, where you're at the center of the volcano, so dike activity is there's a lot of dikes there at all different orientations. There's these things called caldera breccias formed by rock falls along the caldera cliffs, fault gouge from the concentric caldera faults. There's also kind of the only places you get these greenish basalts from chloritization, from hydrothermal circulation in this very volcanically active area, and that chlorite is usually weaker than unaltered basalt. So you have a variation of rock strength. In addition to these more volcanic effects, the lava flow itself are very variable. For example, and depending on the lava characteristics. For example, you can get flows, which are very tall. They have this really dense core that is very vesicle poor. They're not porous at all. They are coated by this weak clinker layer, and that is the technical term, clinker. It kind of coats the top and the bottom of these flows. Then you also have pahoehoe flows that are a lot thinner, and they're a lot more vesicular. They have a lot more exhaled gases in them when they solidify. And a million years later, on Maui, this is what they look like in an outcrop, where you have core that's very thick and blocky, clinker with a bunch of tiny little loose blocks in there, or clinkers in there. When you have a pahoehoe flow, you have some of these little toe lobe structures that are inflating and stuff like that, and they're much thinner, and they're much more vesicular, much more porous. And indeed, geomorphologists have looked at these differences in rock strength in Hawaii before, using Schmidt hammers to show how alternating weak and strong basalt layers can strengthen an outcrop, for example, and where these thick cores outcrop are also where waterfalls that are eroding into the bedrock kind of stall out if there's not enough stream power or stream flow to erode those waterfalls back. So this kind of sets up a unique place to study erosion, and I'm going to go over two projects, one on the erosion of these valleys on West Maui and how variations in bedrock strength might be impacting the formation of these valleys over these long time scales, and also landslides that are happening over time scales that people who live there care about. I'm also going to talk about some of the sedimentation and stream grain size that we measured in these valleys and how they vary all around the islands, possibly due to climate and lithology. And I have to say that these projects are not where I thought this postdoc would go. There have been some roadblocks, and I'm glad that despite that, something is coming out, and I'm excited to show these things. But if there's anything, I would really appreciate any comments, suggestions, corrections to these things. And yeah. So first, I want to talk about how this kind of flat, planed off caldera sequence, those breccias, those hydrothermally altered rocks, are forming some of the biggest valleys on West Maui that are in these purple areas here, and how that's different from the basalt that's kind of peeking out in the back. So again, we're going to use those Schmidt hammers and measure rock strength. We measured rock strength on different basalt flow types and the caldera sequence. So instead of how those previous studies kind of segregated the different measurements by climate, whether it was in the wet side or dry side, we measured on pahoehoe, on core, not the clinker because it's very hard to measure on that, and where we could find outcrops on the caldera sequence. And I have to emphasize that this is great for Hawaii because this method is non-destructive. I didn't have to bring a drill out, hike that up into the mountain, core out the outcrop, destroy the natural beauty, and it kind of saved my life because I could easily get field permits for Schmidt hammer, whereas I don't know how hard it would have been to convince the state to let me drill into an outcrop to collect a rock and hike it out. So it's a great tool for geomorphology and preserving outcrops for future generations. The next thing we did was we calculated volumetric erosion rates. Basically, how the volume in this valley that used to be a shield volcano, how much all that volume was eroded over time. So what we did was we had to estimate what we thought the original shield volcano looked like. We used all the locations of these filled points are relic surfaces in modern topography. We just took those elevations, did a spline over them to create, in this color here, this is our estimation of the original shield surface in these smooth colors. And that is this dashed line over this valley here. We just subtracted from modern topography to get the eroded volume over whatever time it took to erode that. What time? Well, we just assume that erosion mostly occurred after volcanic activity ended, which is pretty accurate looking at some of the extinct volcanoes on the Big Island of Hawaii. It's very, you can see it's a cone still. And on West Maui, it is about 1 million years. Then we just normalize that by valley area because bigger valleys are just by area going to be bigger or have a higher volume eroded, but depending on the depth to erosion, that's going to change, and we get our volumetric or prediction of volumetric erosion from these valleys. Then the last thing we did was look at divide migration, where divides are those ridge lines that separate valleys at their headwaters. And we're looking at specifically whether those divides are stable in their location and time, or whether maybe one valley has a really high erosion rate, maybe it has weaker rock, and will push it to one side or the other over time. In this case, we looked at a valley relief, which is the difference in elevation from that ridge line to the topography to the elevation 500 meters away. So in this kind of diagram here, the relief in Valley 2 is higher than the relief in Valley 1. So maybe it's steeper, maybe erosion is faster on that side. And in this case, the valley is predicted to move to the right. We can quantify the difference in relief on both sides or the asymmetry by using the divide asymmetry index, where a higher value means that that divide is more prone to migrating in time. And there are other methods of doing this, for like comparing elevation or slope on both sides. But I'll just say that we did those tests. They're pretty equal, or the results are pretty consistent. So those were the 3 methods that we used. Showing our field results first. On the x-axis here are the different lithologies that we measured with our Schmidt hammer, strength on the y-axis. I'm showing them in 3 different ways. The box and whisker plots are showing the spread of the 75th to 25th percentile strength, with that red, the white bar in the middle is the median value. Then in the middle are jittered data points of each individual measurement. And then the half violin plots are just the PDFs of the probability distribution functions of all the points, and the big humps are where the dots are concentrated. And yes, the caldera sequence on West Maui, weaker, kind of as we would think. However, we kind of just found one outcrop in the middle of hiking in this valley and came across this thing with a dike coming through and fluvial terrace on the top. And we're like, oh my God, perfect. We didn't see it anywhere else. Luckily, on the island that I live on, there is a community right in the middle of the old caldera. You kind of just pull over on the side of a busy highway, hope no one questions why you're there, do 100 measurements, jump back in your car, pull off, and that is those points in the gray here, and they're largely consistent. They are relatively, both of those are relatively weak. Moving on to the regular basalt flows, the Pahoehoe flows are on average indeed weaker than those thick, blocky flows. However, the spread is really large. And you kind of have to remember that these lava flows, they have almost the exact same chemistry. It's the variation in texture. So maybe some of these outliers for the Pahoehoe, maybe they just happen to have low porosity and they were strong. But in general, the lava flows in the majority of the volcano, strong. The altered basalt in the middle, the caldera sequence, weak, or weaker rock. Then we can look at the volumetric erosion rates with that. So on this blue axis is the mean annual precipitation for all these valleys on West Maui. On this other axis is distance to that caldera sequence, which is around here. Then on the vertical axis is the erosion rates that we calculated, and they're colored the same as on the map. They're also numbered on the map, but there's maybe just 2 groups that I kind of want you guys to concentrate on. One is in this red circle here, where we have several pretty dry valleys, but they have high erosion rates. And you can kind of see here, they have these big amphitheaters heads up in their headwaters, and then they kind of choke down to thinner valleys down where it's really dry. The second thing I want you to notice is that there is those trend of the three largest valleys on West Maui. They're all about 20 square kilometers, but based on their position on the axis with the red arrow, their erosion rates dramatically decrease. So the yellow point would have excavated a huge vertical dimension of rock, whereas this skinny valley here barely cut into the volcano based on, and they're all very wet. They're all very rainy rainforests. They're just different distance, or they just have different coverages of the caldera sequence in them. The last thing is that divide migration, where in the colors here, the darker colors are higher divide asymmetry index. There's more difference in relief on both sides of the ridges, and it's tracing just the locations of the ridges. Then these red arrows here are scaled to that divide asymmetry magnitude, and they're pointing in the direction that the valleys are predicted to grow into. And I think one of the striking things is where the caldera is, the relief is pretty equal. And that doesn't mean that it's not steep in there. It could be very steep on both sides of that ridge. In fact, it is. It's just equal on both sides. In fact, if you were to fly into Maui and you looked at West Maui, you just see the middle of this volcano. It's just gone. It's just like someone took an ice cream scoop in the middle of the volcano a million years ago. We go somewhere farther from the caldera, though, and this is focusing on one of them, and the divide asymmetry is very strong. In fact, we still have the relic surface here, basically the original shield slope in this little nub of a valley here. And on the other side is almost 1,000 meters of relief. It's a huge cliff, and it's very unstable. In rock that is probably just basalt flow, less altered by caldera processes. So, these asymmetric divides are eroding by landslides predominantly, and all these Hawaiian valleys are, and cutting back into the relic surface. But at the same time, like I said, those caldera sequences, they still form knife edges. They're very steep, and they're made of very weak rock, especially in these humid areas with a lot of rainfall, a lot of plants breaking up those rocks, and they could cause, and they probably source a lot of landslides. You go in this valley, you look at the streams, the stream pebbles, a lot of them are weird colors. They're very red, they're baked, so kind of showing this contribution from both regular basalt and this very altered basalt. And this could have affected Hawaiian history in the past. Is anyone here watching or watched Chief of War? Not really. Okay, that's great. Because this is, so it's time for a history lesson. So Hawaii in the 1700s was united for the first time under one kingdom by Kamehameha the Great. And this was done through many bloody battles, and one of which was a battle in 1790. It's the Battle of Kepaniwai, which means dammed water, because so many people died that the stream was dammed with bodies. Kamehameha was from the big island of Hawaii, and he won this battle, but the ruling chiefs of Maui were able to escape through this mountain pass where the divide was low. Maybe because of the caldera center eroding that really weak. In fact, another name is the Battle of the Clawed Cliffs, because people were clawing their way up and over to escape, and you'd rather claw your way over a low pass than the highest one on the island. But in general, we are leveraging, but in the end, we leveraged the topographic data and some field data to do a remote study on valley erosion and divide migration. Maybe this kind of stuff would be cool for landscape evolution modeling, like how Shusung does, but it's also cool to look at how bedrock differences in a place where you might think, oh, it's all basalt. No, volcanic effects like alteration might make some cliffs more unstable to landslides than others. The thing is, these landslides are happening over seconds and minutes, and they affect sedimentation over days, weeks, months, maybe years. But the carving of these valleys happened over 1 million years. What about something that people or city planners might care about today? That's why we also did a lot of surveys in the streams of West Maui. So this picture right here is Iao Valley. It's where that battle happened. Today, it is a state park, but in 2017, a huge flood came through and took out the parking lot of the park. And that erosion was probably exacerbated by these huge boulders in the stream that came tumbling down and impacted the bedrock and the banks, and there's the impacts, there's the saltation and all that stuff eroding the sides of these valleys. And luckily, because it's a park all the way up in this valley, nobody lives there. But if someone did, or if there are communities there, it would be very devastating. Like in the 2018 Santa Barbara wildfires and mud flows, where I think like 20 people were killed and I think 100 houses were destroyed because of the debris flowing down into those man-made culverts that were supposed to divert the sediment, but they got clogged basically, and it overflowed into houses. So to study things like this, geomorphologists might do a pebble count, which is basically going out there and measuring a full population of those sizes and the amounts of sediment and boulders in those streams. And results from hundreds of those might look like this, where on the x-axis is a drainage area above all 91 of these surveys, where the arrow is pointing to surveys that are more downstream. The y-axis is the 84th percentile largest grain size from those surveys that may contain anywhere, I think in this study it was anywhere between about 100 to like 400 grains. And there are two things I want you guys to take away, or that I want to point out in this figure. The first is that here I've kind of divided it with this dashed line from the colluvial portion of the measurements to the fluvial portion of the measurements. That just means upstream, the pebbles are transported by mostly debris flows, downstream is by water. And for the colluvial portion, in the end, the sediment will coarsen, probably because it's by the debris flows, transporting the bigger stuff further. It's also steeper in those areas that can bring the big stuff further down the channel. But for the fluvial part, where things start to be moving by water, then the big stuff is harder to move. So as you go downstream, the grain sizes on average get smaller and smaller. So that's the number one thing I want you to remember. Al Neely, who did this study, got to do it in a mountain, however, that had a lot of bedrock fractures, and right next to it, a mountain that had a lot less bedrock fractures in red, though. So the second thing I want to point out is that bedrock characteristics can play a role in this, where here the bedrock had less fractures, it was less chewed up, and it dumped a lot bigger stuff into the stream here. So in Hawaii, we can test these two trends based on two questions that we can ask. Maybe is weathering kind of breaking up the rocks, where we'd expect on the windward side, where there's presumably a lot of chemical weathering going on, are those sediments smaller than on the dry leeward side? However, maybe the leeward side doesn't have a lot of discharge to be able to bring those bigger grains down. So do the leeward valleys have smaller grain size or smaller sediment size in their streams? So again, we went out onto about 6 or 7 West Maui valleys that we could access by getting to know the people or by getting some state access permits. We did a pebble count where we just laid down 100-meter 100-meter measuring tapes, and at every meter we measured the size of the pebble, or if they were cobble size or smaller, we can use this little template thing. We just stick them through like a little baby toy, right? And get a unbiased size of the sediment. If they're bigger, then we can just measure them with a measuring tape and convert it to a square size so that we can compare them with each other and make a grain size distribution that goes from about 10 centimeters to the biggest boulder that we can imagine. And I need to point out that this is kind of the hiking. There was no trail on Maui. If you go to Hawaii, everyone on Maui knows the trail system on Maui sucks. You kind of have to do illegal things. So access was pretty difficult, especially the highest headwaters. So we took advantage of air photos and where we could, and basically tried to measure the smallest axes of those grains. I know I mentioned your colleague here has the machine learning technique, but we did this manually at every intersection or every meter intersection, and that could be improved because there are different ways to do it, especially because we're combining both of the field and the remote survey. So in order to do that, we just count all of the size fraction smaller than 1/4 of a meter as fine, and we use the rest to calculate the 84th percentile grain size, because for most of them, the less than 84% were smaller than the resolving limit of the air photos. And in total, we got 58 field or air surveys all across West Maui. And here are those results where I'm showing the same axes here, drainage area on the X and the percentile grain size on the Y. Then finally, I'm showing a map of rainfall across West Maui where the bluer colors are more rainy. And there is the windward side on the east and the leeward side on the west. To guide our eye, I'm going to put a boundary at about 1 square kilometer for the difference or the boundary between colluvial and fluvial transport. And we can look at just the leeward valleys first, where I put circles next to the valleys that we were able to access. And yeah, I can kind of see there is a coarsening for the colluvial channels and a fining for the fluvial channels. Great. There are a couple weird points in the middle. What are those? Basically, they are small tributary surveys. In fact, one of them was from air photos above the largest waterfall, about 300 meters on West Maui. So if you have money, you can charter a little helicopter and it goes around those waterfalls. That's a thing you can do. And that might be, and because they're sourced from different parts of the catchment, not along the main trunk, maybe that's why they are smaller here. But in general, we see a coarsening and fining. Great, makes sense. Whew. All that work. Same thing, but these in the stars are the leeward valleys, and because the leeward valleys are so dry, trees and plants like to grow next to the stream, so it limits what we can do for air photo surveys, and we can't really hike all the way up there. So there are two. Can't really make a trend from, what is that? Can't really make a trend from 2 points. Sorry. Yes. Oh, cool. Thanks. Yeah, can't really make a trend from 2 points in the circle here, but they are bigger than the fluvial part where, again, you go more downstream, they begin to fine. So combining it all together, we see a headwater colluvial coarsening and a fluvial fining, a relief. And yeah, indeed, and when we put it together, the stars here begin to plot finer than the circles here, which are the windward valleys. So the leeward side has smaller grains. And indeed, the leeward side has consistently less stream flow. So on the x-axis here is discharge from USGS gauges. And on the y is the probability that that discharge is exceeded throughout the time between 2018 and 2025. The blue lines are the windward, the red lines are the leeward valleys, and because the windward valleys are consistently to our left, they consistently do have higher discharge here. And maybe the higher discharge is allowing windward streams to transport larger boulders from those big flows, those big, thick flows that are taller than me are fracturing at much bigger spaces when they cool and might be supplying some of these bigger grain size that are able to transport further downstream. And maybe chemical weathering in both the leeward and the windward sides are equal because the headwaters kind of meet at the same high elevation area. It's still very rainy, and studies have shown in Hawaii that once you get a high enough annual precipitation, the chemical weathering rate kind of plateaus. So even if you get even more rainfall, the chemical weathering rate doesn't increase as much. So they're sourcing their sediment from the same size anyway, or it's the same area anyway. However, it would be an incomplete discussion without bringing up some complications. One is that sometimes we get big storms coming from the south side. We call those kona storms, like your kona coffee grown on the south side of the island. That could bring higher discharge on some of those leeward dry valleys. Also, the distribution of those thin pahoehoe flows versus the thick flows, they might not be equal in every valley that we surveyed. In fact, some of them we pretty much casually observed was all thin pahoehoe flows, whereas sometimes these really thick flows where I think I'd be shorter than this. I'm tiny. These thick cores outcrop, and then all of a sudden, when we're hiking upstream, we have to climb over these huge boulders, and it takes forever to get across. Once the disappears and it's back to pahoehoe, it's easy walking. So that might be a question to ask again. And there's preliminary evidence to suggest that lithology does affect the grain size here, which is kind of great. One extreme case is that West Maui erupted these weird lavas. I did it again. These weird lavas called benmarites and trachytes. They're really evolved, high silica, high alkali, and because they're so chock full of plage, when they flow, the plage just kind of lines up. And you get this texture called flow foliation that the rocks could break apart when they're finally deposited in a stream. And in the diamonds here, I can add the final 6 surveys from this one valley up here that's all in the green. That is that benmarite trachyte, that weird stuff, whereas all these other valleys are mostly this yellow color that's regular basalt. And the grain sizes are plotting below everything else, despite it being on the west side and presumably high discharge here. Very stormy, very rainy. Always rainy there when we went. One cool thing is that we came across this big boulder, and we came across a section with a bunch of big boulders, and we're like, what is this? Let's do a survey here. We went back to the place we were staying. I pulled out my laptop to look at it, and we were like, oh, that's kind of scalloped. Oh, it's a lot of hummocks here. Oh, you can kind of see the lava flow structure here. Maybe it was a landslide. I don't know. But it would be a cool thing to go back to look at. And there was a lot of questions to keep going here, like, do the differences in and pahoehoe outcrop in the grain size? Or outcrop in the grains, show up in the grain size distribution. And if we look at it in a smaller spatial scale, do they show up? Do the grain sizes get bigger when the a'a'a crops? Do they kind of thin out where the pahoehoe is there? And how far does that effect happen? Does it go all the way downstream where it could flood into where people live, for example? So there's a lot of questions here, but in general, I think the rainy climate and the high stream discharge is likely transporting the largest boulders here, which is important for the erosion. But the basaltic lava flow types, lithology, landslide, volcanic alteration, flash floods, those are further things to look at, and could help us mitigate things like debris flows or debris flow hazards in Hawaii. And I don't think I could have done any of this without any of my, without my collaborators. Aaron Strouch, Hal, and Jody worked with the Department of Land and Natural Resources, allowed us to shadow their stream surveys, their biology surveys. They brought out snorkels and they were in the stream counting the native fish, and we are just behind them trying not to disturb the fish. Malik and Nick are shown in this picture here with me. They dealt with me for 2 weeks in West Maui doing these surveys. I also talked with a lot of my geomorphology colleagues. Shisung helped me. Al Neely helped me with these questions of grain size. And of course, the great professors at the University of Hawaii, particularly my postdoc advisor, Scott Rowland, who is not a geomorphologist, he's a volcanologist. And he really helped me develop the ideas on the volcanic alteration. And last but not least, the state of Hawaii for all the permits and for NSF for giving me the money to do these surveys. And thank you for listening to this.
Thank you, Justin, for this excellent presentation. And do we have any questions?
Yeah.
So how's the state of Hawaii using this information to mitigate landslide patterns?
Ooh, that is the question that I want to get to. I submitted these things as reports to the DLNR, the Department of Land and Natural Resources. I want to get in contact with their workers, especially the ones who helped us in the field, to see if that could be necessary, or if they could use that, especially for planning like the state parks and stuff like that, which might have a lot of those weak rocks. Outside of the state, though, there are a bunch of cultural organizations, especially in some of or the one I can think of is in the south part of the island. They have this little cultural preserve that's kind of flanked on both sides by the by really steep, like V shape. It's like this. It's really dramatic, and they have their little native Hawaiian farm area, but it's right next to the stream, and they notice like every time a flood happens, it changes, and it would be great to be able to give this data to them, maybe continue working with them, do some 3D modeling of that outcrop that's banking their farm and documenting that. Maybe not related to landslides, but to the biologists that we shadowed. They were interested in the grain size stuff for habitat for the native fish, especially, or for like their migration from the coast to from the ocean up the stream, because I don't know the term for that, but that's their life cycle, right? They were interested in that. So once I'm done with this, I will give that to them, and hopefully they can use that for their work. Yeah.
Thank you.
Howdy, thanks a lot. So have you thought of like in the first hypothesis part, where you're maybe measuring erosion rates based on the volumetric missing?
Yeah.
Have you thought about independently measuring erosion rates using another technique?
Yeah. I that would be cool. It would be hard to, I mean, it would be impossible to do it with like the beryllium 10 way that people do, right? Because there's no quartz here. But, coincidentally, in 2024, when we did the survey, we ran into geomorphologists from Arizona State, if you know Kellen Whipple's group, right? And we're like, oh, you're here. Oh, you're here. And they were in the streams with a magnet collecting magnetite to do cosmogenics on that. So maybe that's their domain. And it'd be great to work with them. But I have not thought of that. It would be cool to it would be great if there were more sediment collectors, but they're very spaced out on Maui. In fact, the USGS there was interested in installing more so that you could quantify sediment erosion on a shorter time scale, like the floods, decadal, and stuff like that, using that. But yeah, those are all great things that should be done here, especially with the history of agriculture on West Maui and how that affects sedimentation there. Yeah.
Hi, Justin, Larry. Finally meeting you.
Nice to meet you in person.
Yeah. So great talk, and I love all this topic, and it's part of my PhD as well. So we can talk more, but I would simplify the question to some specific one I'm really interested. But versus one common, and you may look into one paper I noticed from Josh Rowe and others. They do Columbia River basalt.
Oh.
They actually use the fan deposit size, the volume of the fan downstream, compared with the volumetric erosion in the basalt.
Yeah.
So it may be something that you can actually measure both in your setting if you got deposit that downstream to do that. I think I remember there are quite a big fan stuff downstream.
Yes,
Yes,
there are.
You may be able to just compute both and get a relatively good sense about how that preserved. And that's it. I can direct you to that paper. That recent paper.
Yeah, great. That's awesome.
So one question for this is, any major structure like dikes or joints directions data available? Because I realized that the divide migration measures can actually be influenced by those. So
yes. So great. I pulled this one up. So actually, the dashed lines here are tracing 2 generations of rift zones on West Maui. Some of the working hypotheses for why there's 2 is because when this big volcano formed, it changed the stress state of the island. So then it became more, what's the word I'm looking at? It became more easy to fault the other direction. But when I brought up the 3 biggest valleys that were about 20 square kilometers, the biggest one is this one right here. Then the other 2 is this long one here and this other one here, all along the rift zone. So, I mean, that could affect the erosion of it, like the actual volume that's eroded. I haven't thought about how that affects the divide migration.
If you have fracture spacing in general data, that would be awesome.
Oh yeah, I know. Yeah.
Because you measure Schmidt-Hammer, but that's a bulk solid rock strength.
Yeah.
But fracture spacing is a massive. As El Nidis papers mentioned now. So,
yeah.
Well, worth if you got some. I think maybe remote sensing data. If you see any fracture, you probably do that. Well, you can do that.
Yeah. And I'm even thinking maybe on the island I live on, there's a nice place to go hiking. You can start from the bottom, you can hike all the way up and measure the fracture spacing in that. I assume it's the same basalt as on Maui, and it'd be cool to compare that with. Fly a drone, do a structure from motion, that would be cool. Yeah, and actually get that fracture spacing and compare it with the size exactly how Al did. That's something I'm really interested in doing if I'm able to keep doing this. Yeah.
I don't want to borrow too much time. Question. Even though I'll add one more.
Okay, go.
So the channels here looks amazing, but they're kind of tiny in the catchment.
Yeah.
And my understanding is at least some catchment I study, which being considered as tiny, the threshold area between the colluvial and fluvial are at the 10 of a 4 or 3 square kilometer. Here, the threshold area is very, very tiny. So I'm curious how the channel profile look like in here, are they just straight line, no concave up? So basically occluvial, or they're actually pretty concave?
It's pretty concave.
Okay.
What's the concavity? It is close to
0.4?
point. I think it's like 0.5.
Pretty concave.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
it go all the way to 10 to the 10, 10 to the 0.
Yeah.
Okay, and then no questions. I trust you. Yeah, thank you.
Can you hear me? Okay, I was glad that Larry brought up the topic about the fractures and how that impacts your erosion rate. And you mentioned a little bit about, I lost a little bit of the connection between how your fracture and your fracture spacing, how do you connect with the boulder size and with the erosion rate? I think if you can make that connection, it would be awesome. And I study fracture myself. I study natural fractures, and I have a bunch of methods with which we can measure the fracture spacing and in general, the pattern distribution of the fractures. If you go down that road, I can help you.
Great.
But so basically, if you can look laterally or you can look vertically. I study subsurface natural fractures, so I always look at fracture stratigraphy. You know, I measured Schmidt-Hammer data myself in the outcrop. I work on the really hammer ringing sandstones. So different from what you're working on, but I bet if your area has less tectonic influence other than the two shear zones, you know where to look at, and you know to compare the shear zone and no shear zone, or if you have different type of your basalts. So vertically, maybe one type is stacking on top of another, so you can kind of measure how your fracture density varies in those different type of basalts as well.
Yeah. And I think that last half is going to be most of the fractures, like the cooling joints, based on the thickness of the lava flow. Yeah, and I didn't show in the main results, but when I have, I don't know, some supplemental things. Is it going to go now? Where this is the actual distribution of the windward and leeward valleys at their outlets from the manual surveys. And we saw, the leeward is kind of less bimodal than the windward. Maybe that's because the windward valleys could bring the bigger stuff down. And matching that with fracture mapping would be the thing that I want to do next if I had the money to do it, or if I could continue doing this. Yeah.
Exciting.
Yeah, thank you.
One question from the online.
I'm
gonna read it out. The question is, it seems like your sampling locations were based on variability, while
Yes.
is difficult terrain. So how does the bias of where you select your sample or location impact your result?
But that's a hard question. I mean, it definitely does. And, if I plot just the air photo stuff at the, that are at the headwaters, right? They are, and if I plot them, like maybe you can tell the difference between those two. There is a separation between them, and I kind of just have to accept that for now. But the thing that is kind of promising to me is that in both of them, we see the coarsening and fining at the same location. So at least we're measuring the same trends. And maybe I should be doing more of the air surveys at lower elevations where one at lower elevation, so I can get that full coarsening and fining trend to be able to compare the leeward and the windward valleys. And also, it would be great to do more of the air surveys where we have the corresponding field survey, right, to check them. Maybe they'll be different in time because it's limited, but the air surveys and the field surveys are limited by when we did them. But I guess that would be a good first order check to do. Yeah.